Hi, welcome to Hands-On with Force Effect and Force Effect Motion. In this series, we're working to understand and design linkages. In this part specifically, we're going to get our hands dirty with building one of the linkages that we saw in the previous movie. To get started, we'll bring up Autodesk Force Effect Motion. We'll simply tap on the screen to create a new diagram, and we're presented with an option to create a background from either a camera image, a photo album, or something we have stored on Autodesk 360. We're going to go ahead into our photo album and select the shopping cart that we used in the previous video. We can use the pinch zoom on our screen to adjust the size of the image for our design. Now that we have the image in position, I wanted to call out one way to become familiar with the interface. The eye in the upper right hand corner allows you to see different ways that you can get help through tutorials and help files, and in this case tooltips. By tapping the tooltips, labels for each of the buttons within the interface pop up. This allows you to become familiar with things as you get started. Once you understand things a little more, you won't need this, but it's a nice way to get moving. We can tap on the screen to hide those tooltips, and you can see that our Elements command is already enabled. We're going to use the Elements command to begin sketching our shopping cart. We're going to sketch the back of the shopping cart, and we know that this component is held in place or grounded, it can't move, because the person's holding the handle and keeping the shopping cart steady. We're going to go to our Support submenu and select the Grounded option to represent that. You can see by adding the Grounded option, the style of the element changes so that you can visually see that this item is grounded. There's also an icon added at the bottom of the element. We can now return to our Element command and continue designing. We're going to go ahead and add a section for the bottom half of the seat back. And we're going to split this into two sections. We're going to stop that element, and we're going to create another element starting at the end of the previous element and extending up to the person's hand. And I'll show you why we did that in just a moment. While designing, it's always handy to test how motion's happening as you build. You can use the kinematic testing mode in order to tap on an element and drag with your finger to see what motion is available. Now you can see here, because we split that into two elements, the back of the seat pivots and moves in a way that's not expected. We can click undo on the top of the screen to return all the elements to their original position. Now we don't want the back of that seat pivoting, so we're going to go to our selection tool and we're going to tap on pivot point D, and we're going to change that to a welded pin joint from a standard joint. You can see the icon or the pivot point changes, and if we go back to the kinematic mode and we drag, you can see that this moves as a single element now. Now you might be asking, why would we split that into two? And I'll show you now. If you go back to the Elements menu and we add the seat, and we're going to snap it into the top section of the shopping cart seat back, everything becomes grounded. So what we need to do is change the pivot point G to represent a different type of joint. We're going to go to our selection tool and we'll tap on pivot point G, and we now have the ability to select standard joint, welded pin joint, or in this case we're going to use sliding joint. And if we return to the kinematic mode and we test this motion, you'll notice that as we move the seat, when we get to the pivot point D, everything bottoms out. The sliding joint can only run on a single element, and so it's a great way to add a limit or a minimum or a maximum to your pivot joints or to your design. We'll click undo to put everything back in its position. And now we have the opportunity to look at something else in Force Effect Motion, and that's actuators. Within the actuator submenu, you have rotary motion and you have linear motion. We're going to work with linear motion that represents this person's arm. Before we do that, we need to create an element on the screen that represents the upper portion of this person's arm. And we're going to go ahead and create just a small component, and we're going to use the support menu to create a grounded support on that element. We're going to assume that this person is standing still. Now that we have the person's arm represented in the diagram, we can return to the actuator submenu and select the linear actuator. We can then draw an actuator in the same way we would draw an element. We're going to start at the point we want to begin, tap and drag on the screen, and end where we want that actuator connected. If we go to the selection tool and tap on the actuator itself, you can see that we have a few different options of how to move this cylinder and the piston within the element. If we tap and drag on the square on the left side, we can adjust the length of the cylinder itself. If we tap and drag on the square on the right, we can also adjust the length of the cylinder. The third option is the square in the middle, and that allows us to decide where the piston is within the cylinder stroke. And in this case, we're going to bottom it out or fully extend it. And the reason for this is if we hit play on the screen, the first action of the linear actuator is going to be to pull the piston back into the cylinder, representing a person pulling on the back of the seat. You can see here that we're getting the type of motion that we expect. This should give you enough information on how to get started in building linkages, and we'll use that as we move forward in this series.